Hey everyone, it's time to build another rack. I'm actually building this one to match another one that I've made since the original one that I did a video on a handful of years ago. There were two main factors that I was looking to improve with building a new rack. One was to have it more sturdy. The original one was held together with nails and a few small wooden supports and just didn't hold square all that well. And then the other is more rack space. I've been fortunate to work with a lot of really amazing bands, and I've been able to put some of that money back into the studio and improving and growing the equipment that I'm using, so I simply need more rack space. I could probably buy a rack for the same amount of money or potentially even less, but I like working with my hands and doing these kinds of projects. But I'd also rather be proud of something that I built than something that I bought. So with that, let's go over exactly what I'm going to be building. It's going to be 20 rack units tall, with a front that's angled back a bit so that gear at the bottom of the rack will be a little more accessible from a seated position. I just figured out the angle based on sitting in the chair I'm generally in during sessions and mixing and feeling what was comfortable for me, and it ended up being about 15 degrees back or 75 degrees from the floor. But I highly recommend figuring out this angle and the rest of the measurements for yourself based on what's comfortable for you and what fits your needs. At the same time, a lot of you have requested measurements that I've used in the last video I did on this, so I'm going to be including all of my measurements for this video. So starting with that, I'm going to be building it out of 3/4 inch birch plywood. There are two tall side pieces that are 42 inches tall, 22 inches on the bottom, and 12 inches on the top. The gear being at an angle prevents an extra unit from fitting right at the bottom where it'd be too low to easily reach anyway, so I gave the bottom a flat front 4 inches tall to mirror the inset supports I'd be putting in. The bottom and top pieces are both 20 and 3/4 inches wide, and the bottom is 22 inches deep, while the top is 12 inches deep. I'm using 4 support pieces to hold the rack square and sturdy. Each of these pieces is 19 1/4 inches long and 4 inches tall, but there's an important difference in these pieces. 2 of them are the same, with the tops and bottoms both cut to a 90-degree angle. The other 2 pieces are cut on one side with a 15-degree angle. One of these pieces fits at the top and allows a piece of gear to go right at the top rack space without the support blocking it. The other piece goes at the bottom and has the same function, allowing the bottom space to be used without the angle of the gear causing a problem. Here are all the pieces together with the measurements that I used. With the whole rack planned, I laid out the pieces onto plywood using a T-square to keep all my cuts perpendicular. I made a jig for the circular saw out of a scrap piece of masonite. There are instructions for building these everywhere online, and they're incredibly useful, especially if you don't have a table saw with a large bed. With the pieces cut, I hid the plywood edges with birch veneer. It comes in a roll like this and is really easy to use. You just iron it on and press it down as it cools. I found this nifty edge trimmer tool that made cutting off the excess veneer much easier. It takes a little practice, but it leaves you with a pretty clean edge. Now everything was cut and veneered, so I sanded everything with 220 grit sandpaper. There's no need to go any finer here because the grain will be raised once the pieces are stained, and the rack's smoothness will ultimately come from sanding the final clear coats. Before staining, I wanted to do a test fit and drill the screw holes. I used these handy right angle clamps to keep everything square, which is especially helpful for large projects when you only have 2 hands. I measured evenly from the edges with a combination square, drilled the holes, and screwed it together. Here it is assembled.
And every girl that I've ever thought of wedding has been wedded down there.
I want to paint the inside of the rack black, so I took this time to mark the boundaries. It's much easier to do this with all the pieces together.
Like everyone I know, everyone.
With everything marked, I taped off all the spots I wanted to block from stain. I did this whole process inside to keep any outside dust, bugs, or anything else from sticking to the stain. For the stain, I used Minwax Jacobian oil-based stain. It's inexpensive and has a really nice rich color that isn't too red or too black. I've used the same color for the wall panels that you might have seen in the background of my other videos. My first coat of stain, which I painted on with a synthetic brush, wasn't too thick. While you are going to be wiping off the excess, it's easier to try to put on only the stain that will mostly absorb in that coat. I let the first coat set for about 10 minutes and then wiped off the excess stain thoroughly. It's important to get off as much excess as possible or the stain will stay gummy rather than completely drying. Here are the pieces after the first coat. I did a second coat on all the pieces the same way, same amount of time and getting all of the excess off that I could. Then I let the pieces dry for 24 hours and then wiped off any last bit of stain that hadn't absorbed into the wood. When I was sure it was completely dry, I peeled off the painter's tape and did the reverse, taping off the stain, leaving just the interior parts that I wanted to paint black. I ended up doing about 4 light but thorough coats of spray paint, as I've had a tendency to lay it on a little bit thick in the past, which just adds more drying time. There's a lot of surface area to cover, so it took about 3 full cans of satin black spray paint. Once dry, I peeled off the tape, which is even more satisfying to do than it is to watch. Next came the clear coat. I'm using Minwax polycrylic, which I've used and liked before. It's fairly forgiving, cleans up with water, and it dries to a really nice water-resistant finish. I've seen a lot of differing opinions on the best process for using it, but here's what's worked best for me. The first coat is essentially a grain-filling coat. As I mentioned before, the stain raises the grain so it won't be perfectly smooth even if you sanded it like crazy before staining. You don't want there to be drips, but having the first coat as light as possible isn't ideal either. A nice medium coat painting with the grain is perfect. The pieces already look beautiful after one coat, but you can still feel the grain. The polycrylic dries pretty quickly and is ready to sand in about 2 hours. I sand the first coat pretty heavily with 220 grit paper, which just leaves a light film on the surface, but more importantly leaves the finish in the low parts of the grain. It's important to wipe off all the dust with a clean cloth so your surface keeps getting smoother as you build up coats. Minwax recommends doing 3 coats of polycrylic, but since my first layer is mostly sanded off, I did 4, sanding lightly with finer papers between each coat. I originally tried doing really thin coats, but found going a little thicker allowed brush strokes to self-level a little better before it dried. Here are the pieces after their final coat. With all the pieces finished, it was time to reassemble the rack. I used some casters to make it a little easier to pull out the rack, installed the rack rails, and with that, the rack was done. And here it is moved into the studio. You can see the previous one matched this new one for a total of 40 rack units. So thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below and I'll do my best to help as much as I can. I have new music coming out soon, new compressor shootouts and amp demos and all sorts of things, so stay tuned for that. Please like and subscribe. I really appreciate your support. You can follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/JesseGimbelsBasement. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon.